Hello and welcome to Ashrit's Tipping Points, a podcast where I explore world tipping points that affect me and you personally. In the last episode, we looked at the Petro Bros, who set England up for petroleum extraction in the Middle East to catch up with the United States of America. Well, the other powers of the world aren't going to sit back and let the British Empire take the lead again, knowing the military uses and the wealth generation potential at stake. France, the Netherlands, and of course the juggernaut the United States of America want to elbow their way into the Middle East as well. And one man will be instrumental in helping them do it. His name is Calouste Gulbenkian, also known as Mr. 5%. Here we go. Calouste Gulbenkian, I apologize if I'm butchering that name, was born into a noble Armenian family in 1869 in Constantinople, and received his education at a local Armenian school. He later studied at a private French school which was founded in 1870, called Lycée Saint-Joseph, which is still around in Istanbul today. Calouste likely learned French there, at least as a second language, which will be important later in his life. Something interesting to remember that French was, for much of early colonial European history, the common language of Europe, and soon after that, the world. France emerged as the leading political, economic, and cultural force in Europe, and its language spread throughout the courts of the UK, Sweden, and Russia in the 1500s. It became the common language between diplomats, merchants, and academics, and remained this way up until the end of World War II, when the overwhelming power and stature of the United States of America meant that English became the de facto lingua franca. In fact, France's power and French as a language started to decline already when the World War I Treaty of Versailles was written in both French and English, something that the French would not have preferred. So during the time of Calouste, our protagonist for this episode, French would have been a globally important diplomatic and academic language. So his schooling at a prestigious French school would have been a calculated move for his success later in life. Already by the late 1800s, however, the power of the USA was rising, largely thanks to its oil success. Calouste would, after his French schooling, study at Robert College, a school founded by a wealthy American philanthropist named Christopher Robert and an American missionary named Cyrus Hamlin in 1863. This is the oldest American school currently operating outside the United States. It's highly selective, independent, and private even now, as it was back then. Calouste likely learned some English here. So Calouste had money and privilege growing up to be able to afford these schools. His family are believed to be the descendants of the Rishtunis, an Armenian noble family that had a history of struggle with both the Byzantines and the Arabs, and their history dates way back to the 400s. Sometimes when I read history, I wonder about whatever happened to the descendants of important, noble families. Some of these families truly changed the course of history, and I'd argue that Calouste's family, the Gulbenkians, is one of those families. Whatever happened to the descendants of powerful merchant families that once controlled sea trade routes, or kings who conquered the world, What are Genghis Khan's direct descendants doing now? I don't mean his infamously plentiful accidental progeny. I mean his official lineage. You can trace it quite far down. In the Yuan dynasty, for example, let's say until the 1600s when it starts to collapse. And then the trail soon afterwards vanishes. I always think it's a rare and privileged thing to know where you came from. I can trace my family back a few generations and then the trail disappears. That's something that scares me for future generations. And I keep video interviews of all my family members recounting their life stories, and I hope it's a tradition that will be passed down the line until the end of time, even though I know it won't be. But some families in history know where they came from. The Gulbenkian family is one of those privileged families. Apparently they used to be called the Rushtunis, this Armenian noble family. In the mid-600s, the Arabs invade Armenia and win, and the Rushtunis are later exiled by the Arabs. Eventually, in the 11th century, 400 years later, they settle in the Byzantine territories and take a Byzantine title, Vart Badrik. I'm probably butchering all the names in this episode. Another amazing thing is how, through the histories of these families, you can also see how so many peoples around the world were displaced by war and conquest, and also changed their identities, literally their family names rewritten. It even happened to nobles. Can you imagine how it happened to peasants? Right, one generation you're a French peasant, you get conquered by another power, let's say the Romans, and 3 generations later your grandchildren or great-grandchildren are Roman peasants. And then one day their descendants will be saying, we've been Roman for time immemorial, but that isn't the case. It always makes me question strong identities of people, even today. For myself, also. Many of us who identify with our names and places of origin probably are descended from families that were at some point coerced economically or militarily into adopting that identity or religion. Something to think about. Back to the Rushtuni family, then called Vart Badrik, after they changed their name for the Byzantines, they'll have to change their identity again when the Ottoman Turks take over. They'll use the Turkish equivalent of Vart Badrik, which is apparently Gulbenk. It's beyond me how that translation occurs, but a linguist would probably know better. The Gulbenks settled in the town of Talas, owning property there until eventually moving to Istanbul. So far, I'm impressed with the resilience of this lineage, of this house. Multiple invasions, multiple displacements, multiple identity changes, and they're still moving around, buying property and making their names known. The family established close relations with the House of Osman, the Ottoman rulers, and by 1860, Calouste's father was an oil importer. His father, Sarkis, owned many oil fields in the Caucasus, mainly in Baku, which was the center of Central Asia's oil production at the time. Sarkis, Calouste's father, was also involved with Russian oil interests at the time, being tied up with the Rothschild family, the Nobel family, and an Armenian-Russian oil magnate named Alexander Mantashev. We'll come back to him in a moment. If you're wondering why the Nobel family and Rothschild families are in there, interesting side note, the credit for creating the Russian oil industry goes to Ludwig Nobel, a Swedish-Russian engineer and the older brother of Alfred Nobel, founder of the Nobel Prize. A bit crazy when you realize how incestuous many of history's prominent people and achievements really are. In 1884, young Calouste moved to Marseille, at the age of 15 to perfect his French at a high school there. After high school, his father sent him to be educated at King's College London, where Calouste studied petroleum engineering. It seems that by now his father is grooming him for a career in the oil industry. After graduating, he went to Baku to study the Russian oil industry. The oil fields in Baku were owned partly by the Nobel family, whom his father was familiar with. So this is something like going to study at your uncle's family business. Not exactly like that, the scales are different, and his father was more of a business partner than a friend. But you know what I mean, friends in high places sort of thing. Finally, Calouste returns to the Ottoman Empire, now an oil aficionado, and gets commissioned by some of the people in the highest positions of government there. Again, friends in high places. In 1887, the Ottoman Minister of Finance, who's an Armenian Christian named Hagpop Pasha, had Calouste survey Mesopotamia, that being modern Syria and Iraq, for oil. Calouste's survey suggested that there were vast oil reserves in Mesopotamia, and Hagpop, the Ottoman Minister of Finance, acquired land for the Ottoman Empire there to establish the Ottoman oil industry. In 1895, 8 years later, Calouste started his oil operation business. Himself being an expert in the field and having a family history of connections with the industry, it only made sense for him to try his own thing as well. So far, things are going swimmingly for Calouste, but catastrophe would soon strike for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. To understand this catastrophe, we have to understand the position of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. As European interests encroached on the peripheries of the Ottoman Empire through the 1800s, the clamor for self-determination rose within minority communities on the fringes of the empire. This happens in many multicultural empires as their power wanes and they become less capable of applying economic or military force to glue the various pieces together. Armenians, largely Christian, were always considered second-class citizens in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, and in the late 1800s they began to ask for civil reforms. By one account, Armenians asked for an end to, quote, the looting and murder in Armenian towns by Kurds and Circassians, improprieties during tax collection, criminal behavior by government officials, and the refusal to accept Christians as witnesses in trial, end quote. So they were being pretty heavily discriminated against, based on their religion. The Ottoman government ignored the requests of the Armenians, and the nascent form of Armenian nationalism spread in Anatolia, including demands for equal rights and autonomy. The Ottoman leadership believed that this threatened the Islamic underpinning of the empire. After all, the vast majority of territories were Islamic in the Ottoman Empire, and this was a big part of the basis for rule in territories like Arabia. Works for the Muslim populations, but doesn't work so well for the Christian populations. A combination of factors increased Armenian hopes and restiveness. For one, the Russians won the Russo-Turkish War, leading to Armenian hopes that they would be liberated and ruled by a Christian Russia. Yes, there were days where peoples hoped they would be ruled by Russia. And even today, Armenia gets some of its support from Russia, while Azerbaijan gets its support from Turkey, so this is a bit of an ongoing thing. But the Ottoman Sultan was paranoid. He believed that the woes of the Ottoman Empire stemmed from, quote, the endless persecutions and hostilities of the Christian world, end quote. He perceived Ottoman Armenians as an arm of foreign hostilities, a means by which Europe could, quote, get at our most vital places and tear out our very guts. End quote. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling, and the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, used pan-Islamism as a way to unite the empire. The Armenians sent a delegation in 1878 to the Congress of Berlin, which was a conference to reorganize the Balkan states after the Russo-Turkish War, which Russia won. The Armenians sent this delegation to lobby European powers to make sure that in the subsequent treaty there were proper safeguards for Armenian kinsmen in the peace agreement. Sultan Hamid said, quote, "Such great impudence, such great treachery toward religion and state, may they be cursed upon by God." End quote. And he would also say, they're like, quote, "hired female mourners who simulate a pain which they do not feel. They are an effeminate and cowardly people who hide beneath the clothes of the great powers and raise an outcry for the smallest of causes." End quote. A Turkish historian who biographed the Ottoman Sultan said, quote, "The mere mention of the word reform irritated him, inciting his criminal instincts." End quote. Well, soon his criminal instincts would reach a boiling point. Bloodshed escalated when Armenian resistance against double taxation confronted the Ottoman army and Kurdish irregulars. The Armenians later succumbed to the Turkish promises of amnesty, which never materialized. And by the way, in the Congress of Berlin, the following peace agreement would contain clauses for the protection of Armenians, which the Sultan of Turkey, or my mistake, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, never followed. The governor of an Ottoman region called Mush responded by inciting local Muslims against local Armenians. Historian Kinross writes that massacres of this kind were common, and often achieved by gathering Muslims at a local mosque and claiming that Armenians had the aim of striking at Islam. If it sounds familiar, it's because these kinds of tactics are still used in countries today, mostly still Muslim countries. Sultan Hamid sent the Ottoman army into the area, and violence against Armenians soon spread to other towns as well. Massacres of Armenians broke out in Constantinople. Thousands were killed at the hands of their Muslim neighbors and government soldiers. I will let a contemporary witness describe the scene for you. A warning in advance that it is going to be brutal. American journalist William Sachtleben says from Erzurum in the Ottoman Empire, quote, "What I myself saw this Friday afternoon is forever engraven on my mind as the most horrible sight a man can see. I went with one of the cavasses of the English legation, a soldier, my interpreter, and a photographer, Armenian, to the Gregorian Cemetery. Along the wall on the north, in a row of 20 feet wide and 150 feet long, lay 321 dead bodies of the massacred Armenians. Many were fearfully mangled and mutilated. I saw one with his face completely smashed in with a blow of some heavy weapon after he was killed. I saw some with their own necks almost severed by a sword cut. One I saw whose whole chest had been skinned. His forearms were cut off, while the upper arm was skinned of flesh. I asked if the dogs had done this. And quoting from his article, no, the Turks did it with their knives. End quote, but continuing on Williams' article. A dozen bodies were half burned. All the corpses had been rifled of all their clothes except a cotton undergarment or two. To be killed in battle by brave men is one thing. To be butchered by cowardly armed soldiers in cold blood and utterly defenseless is another thing." End quote. The French vice-consul of Diyarbakir recounted stories of Armenian women and children being assaulted. He describes the attackers, quote, as cowardly as they were cruel. They refused to attack where people defended themselves, and instead concentrated on defenseless districts. End quote. In Urfa, Ottoman troops burned a church where 3,000 Armenians had taken refuge, and shot anyone who tried to escape. The chief Turkish interpreter of the British embassy wrote that the Ottomans were, quote, guided by their general action by the prescriptions of Sharia law. That law prescribes that if the Raya, subject, Christian, attempts by having recourse to foreign powers to overstep the limits of privileges allowed to them by their Musalman masters and free themselves from their bondage, their lives and property are to be forfeited and are at the mercy of the Musalmans. To the Turkish mind, the Armenians had tried to overstep these limits by appealing to foreign powers, especially England. They, therefore, considered it their religious duty and a righteous thing to destroy and seize the lives and property of these Armenians. End quote. Musalman is another word for Muslim, by the way. One soldier wrote proudly, quote, my brother, if you want news from here, we have killed 1,200 Armenians, all of them as food for the dogs. Mother, I am safe and sound. Father, 20 days ago we made war on the Armenian unbelievers. Through God's grace, no harm befell us. There is a rumor afoot that our battalion will be ordered to your part of the world. If so, we will kill all the Armenians there. Besides, 511 Armenians were wounded. 1 or 2 perish every day. If you ask after the soldiers and Bashi Buzuks, which means wild irregulars, not one of their noses has bled. May God bless you. End quote. That quote has a strange, casual, yet so brutal tone to it, doesn't it? He goes from saying, brother, I killed a bunch of Armenians, they're food for the dogs. Oh, by the way, mother, I'm safe and sound. All right, back to the killing. Father, 20 days ago we did this, we did that. God's grace, nothing happened to us. It just goes to show the kind of attitude and tone that people had, that this person could write such a thing so casually to his family. The killings continued until 1897. The German pastor Johannes Lepsius collected all the data, and in his calculations, 88,000 Armenians died. Another 546,000 were left destitute, meaning their possessions were likely taken from them. 2,493 villages were destroyed. 646 of those villages' residents were converted to Islam. God knows what happened to the remainder. Another 100,000 Armenians died due to famine and disease. So in 1896, while the killings were happening, Calouste and the Gulbenkian family fled the Ottoman Empire, right? They've had a history with running away from conquering armies, the Arabs, the Byzantines. 1896, they flee the Ottomans. And they end up in Egypt, where Calouste met with his father's acquaintance, the Russian oil oligarch Alexander Mantashev. If you'll remember, Egypt in the late 1800s is controlled by the British, which we covered in the episode about the Canal of the Pharaohs. The British took over the canal and they still own it in 1896, and Egypt is pretty much a colony of theirs. A quick detour on the Russian oil oligarch Alexander Mantashev. He was born in a Russian part of northern Iran called Tiflis in 1842. He moved to Manchester in 1869, where he intricately learned the cotton industry, European business practices, English, French, and German. he would return to Tiflis, start a successful cotton trade with his father, and eventually purchase shares in the Tiflis Central Commercial Bank, becoming its principal shareholder. He would eventually join the Russian Duma, something like their parliament, and he was known to be someone not afraid of high-risk investments. He eventually bought unprofitable oil wells in Baku and turned them profitable. And in 1894, he created an association with other oil interests in Russia, including the Rothschild family and the Nobels. It was on a trip to Egypt in 1896 that he bumped into Calouste. He was likely impressed enough with Calouste that he introduced him to various friends in high places, including to Sir Evelyn Baring, the British statesman. So Calouste, still in his 20s by the way, moves to London, where he arranges deals in the oil business. He became a naturalized British citizen in 1902. Like many of the people we covered in this podcast season, a lot of things flow through London. So many of the most successful people in the world in the 1900s and the 1800s moved to London at some point and get a British citizenship. Not dissimilar to how people do the same with America today. Right? Many of the smartest, most successful people in the world, say Elon Musk, for example, was from South Africa, but to achieve his dreams he moved to the US, and now he's an American citizen. In 1907, Calouste helped arrange the merger of the Royal Dutch Petroleum Company with Shell Transport and Trading Company Limited, and Calouste emerged as a major shareholder in the merged company, Royal Dutch Shell. Yes, that Shell that you see petrol bunks of all around the world. Calouste helped create that entity. Calouste would maintain a policy of getting 5% shares in any oil company he was involved with, giving him the name Mr. 5%. Eventually, he became a financial and economic advisor to the Turkish embassy in London and Paris, and later, chief financial advisor to the Turkish government. That brings us to finally, perhaps the most influential deal of his life. Now, regarding oil, the most important thing that comes out of World War I is the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and its division between British and French. Oil was transforming life in the USA and Europe, perhaps even more than the sugar and cash crop revolutions of the 16 and 1700s that we covered in Redland's Black Hands. So naturally, colonial priorities shift from maintaining vast tracts of agricultural land to controlling oil basins. Where previously the Middle East had been tasked as a buffer zone to protect British India, which was a major source of cash crops, during World War I, so important were the oil interests in the Middle East that Indian troops were shipped to fight on that front. The tables had turned, and with British officers so tied up in Europe, the British needed help to do that, to protect the Middle East. Nearly 2 million Indians fought in World War I, 700,000 of whom fought in Mesopotamia, including my great-grandfather, against the Ottoman Empire. And with the sheer scale of crucial military support Indians were giving the British Empire, the clamor for home rule grew. Home rule being self-government under the British monarchy, something like what Canada and Australia had. This meant that as Indians were going abroad, they were learning Western politics and military tactics, fighting for supposed democracy and freedom, and after the war they returned to a non-free, non-democratic India, from where many of them joined the independence movement. So partially due to the Middle East becoming an important region for the world for oil, it accelerates the independence of India and flips the script in terms of India's place in the British Empire. We covered in previous episodes how the Ottoman Empire served as a buffer state between British and Russian empires, and that all the major powers of the time wanted them weak but stable, because instability would mean that one of the other great powers might end up with an unwelcome advantage by snapping up the pieces, if the Ottomans should ever collapse. That policy started to change after the Ottoman bankruptcy. In 1878, Britain had seized Cyprus, another Ottoman territory, and just 4 years later, Britain seized Egypt and the Suez Canal to secure the route to India. And of course, it would also mean war and chaos. Well, all that changes when the world is in an existential war with the Ottomans as part of World War I. And the Ottomans have joined the Allies' arch nemesis, Germany. The Allies enter the war against the Ottomans, which makes them ask each other questions such as, well, what do we do if they collapse? When they collapse? And can we come to an agreement so that no one ends up with an undue advantage? During the war, in the interest of disintegrating the Ottoman Empire from within, the British had supported Arab nationalism. This is because the Ottomans, though they were Muslim like the Arabs, are ethnically Turkish, and they ruled over great parts of the once great and powerful Arab world. Arabs, being another ethnicity and with their own language and customs, didn't like this. The famous Lawrence of Arabia, one of my favorite movies, but the person, Lawrence of Arabia, and other British agents were used to support Arab nationals in their uprisings against the Ottomans. The House of Saud of Saudi Arabia receives support from the British during this time as well to fight the Ottomans, eventually leading to the formation of the country or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a major oil power even today. However, the French don't like the idea of Arab nationalism. For one, the French had possessions in Algeria, in North Africa, where Arabic influence is strong. Secondly, the French saw Arab nationalism as a vehicle for British influence peddling in the Middle East. And so, in the event of an Ottoman collapse, the French wanted the Levant, that being the area around Lebanon and Palestine, to be part of the French Empire, or at least the French sphere of influence. Partially because they have had commercial and religious interests there dating back centuries, and partially because the region is also the gateway to North Africa, where the French maintain some colonial possessions. So the British and the French meet secretly, though with some tacit agreement from the Russians and Italians, and they divide the future Middle East between them. The French will get southeastern Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. The British, who control Egypt and Suez, will get the area around there, with southern Israel. And they'll also get the area around Iraq, which is on the east side of the Arabian Peninsula, which grants them more control over threats to Indian waters. The Russians will get western Armenia. Palestine, as a holy land with great symbolism, will be ruled internationally, though with British troops on the ground. What's also interesting here is that the British want to control the area around Suez for purely selfish reasons, but this kind of empire building and carving lines in the sand was already becoming internationally unpopular by the early 1900s. And so the British wanted to disguise it somehow. Especially because when the Americans joined the war effort in World War I, Woodrow Wilson makes it clear that he would prefer to see that subject and stateless peoples should be able to choose their own destinies instead. So the British needed a reason to claim half of the Middle East. And what better reason than saving an oppressed people? According to James Barr in his history, A Line in the Sand, quote, they quickly realized that by publicly supporting Zionist aspirations to make Palestine a Jewish state, they could secure the exposed east flank of the Suez Canal, while dodging accusations that they were land grabbing. What seemed at the time to be an ingenious way to outmaneuver France has had devastating repercussions ever since. The British knew from the outset that this move risked causing deep anger in the Muslim world, but they were confident they could overcome it. They believed that the Arabs would recognize the economic advantages of Jewish immigration, and that the Jews would long be grateful to Britain for helping them realize their dream. Both assumptions proved to be wrong. When Jewish immigration triggered Arab outrage, British attempts to keep the peace by slowing change swiftly exasperated the Jews. End quote. So if we're talking about tipping points that affect us to this day, the whole war in the Middle East between the Jews and the Muslims, i.e. Israel and Palestine, and of course surrounding Arab countries, was started because Britain used Zionism as a disguise to secure the Suez Canal. Britain is long gone from Suez, but the tensions that it created there are a defining characteristic of that region even today. And at one point, decades later, while World War II was going on, the British curbed Jewish immigration to placate the Arabs. The Jews, not being happy about that, launched terrorist activities against the British to kick them out so they can continue immigrating to Palestine. Not least of reasons being that they were being killed in millions in Europe by the Nazis. A British officer just back from a visit to the Middle East said, quote, the terrorists would seem to be receiving support from the French, and we know from top-secret sources that French officials in the Levant have been clandestinely selling arms to the Haganah, a Jewish militia, and we have received recent reports of their intention to stir up strife within Palestine. End quote. And so, through 2 world wars, with British and French troops dying arm in both of them, they are sabotaging each other's interests and funding terrorism against each other in Palestine and the Middle East. Geopolitics is a strange thing. This is, by the way, one of the tipping points that creates Israel in the future, but that's not part of this season. Now, one of the problems that comes out of these agreements is that nobody asked the Arabs. The Arabs supported the British war against the Ottomans in return for a promise of a national homeland. The British, as is classic for them, didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. And all this happened in secret, because obviously the Arabs, Americans, Germans, Turks, or other interested parties shouldn't know that the plan was to split up Ottoman possessions. This agreement remained a secret only until the Bolsheviks in Russia exposed them after taking control of Russian state information. So the Bolsheviks took over. They must have found a whole bunch of secret state documents that the Tsar had, and one of them was this agreement. And the Bolsheviks exposed it. According to Peter Mansfeld in The British Empire magazine, quote, the British were embarrassed, the Arabs dismayed, and the Turks delighted, end quote. At the exposing of this information, that is. At the same time, the British hurried to plug possible loopholes in their screen around the Gulf by signing yet another series of agreements with all the Arab states, from Bahrain and Kuwait to the Trucial States and Muscat, giving Britain exclusive rights to oil concessions in all of their territories. We covered in Pax Britannia Arabica how Britain had already agreed to protect these countries in terms of maritime protection in exchange for some control over their coastlines and their policies, but now they're re-signing those agreements, specifically mentioning oil. These updated treaties were the first indication that Britain would soon switch her policy from maritime containment in the interests of India to territorial engagement for economic gain. Now, I know I've spent a bit of time on it already, but this marks a crucial shift in world politics and interests. From protecting colonial suppliers of raw materials and captive markets towards a different kind of paradigm, securing the military and economically paramount resource of the future, that is oil. Now, that paradigm is more similar to the world that we see today. Such was the potential of oil that it could compete with and surpass the prize of the colonial and medieval world, which was agriculture. That prize, having hundreds of millions of people grow things for you, food, cash crops, shipping it to your country to process it in factories, and develop technology, that is no longer, after this 1914 set of agreements, that is no longer the state of the world. It turned out that the areas that the French fought for in the Middle East had little oil potential, but the British protectorates had it in spades. Now, even though Britain got lucky here, the world isn't Britain's oyster anymore. Commercial and political pressure urges the United States of America to enter the Middle Eastern arena. Iraq became dominated by US oil companies, while Kuwait retained a 50-50 split between British and American companies. However, even though oil came up in commercial quantities, during these years, Middle Eastern oil was used more or less locally and via Suez to Western Europe, and only made up 5% of world oil production in the pre-World War II years. The important thing here is that the infrastructure and ownership framework was put in place for the post-World War II and 21st century expansion. The dominant oil companies became collectively known as the Seven Sisters, the companies that would extract the majority of the world's black gold from the ground to transform humanity forever. These sisters were Standard Oil in New Jersey, which would later become Exxon, Standard Oil New York, later known as Mobil, which would be merged into ExxonMobil, Standard Oil California, today known as Chevron, Texas Oil, today known as Texaco, Gulf Oil, which would later merge with Chevron, Anglo-Persian Oil, today known as BP, British Petroleum, and Royal Dutch Shell. You can see the American dominance of oil here too. 5 out of the 7 companies were American, 1 was British, and 1 was Dutch. During World War I, the Allies took over Deutsche Bank's share of the Turkish Petroleum Company and transferred them to France. French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, I'm probably butchering that name, was determined to create an independent French oil company that could compete with major British and American oil giants. In 1920, the European victors got together to sign the San Remo Agreement, which excluded American companies from the Turkish petroleum takeover. You see, this was the end of World War I, and Europe was still trying to claw back its dominance over the world. They weren't ready to let America take center stage over the whole world. Now, this provoked strong protests from American oil companies, who feared that Europeans would deny them access to world markets. and that Europeans would extract and dump cheap Middle Eastern oil around the world, ending the American oil dominance. The US Department of State by then, 1920, was active with ensuring American business interests are respected around the world. US Congress passed the Mineral Leasing Act in February 1920, which denied drilling rights on publicly owned land in the USA to any foreign company whose parent government discriminated against American businesses. Now, both the British and American governments wanted to maintain good relations with each other, so they reorganized the Turkish Petroleum Company in 1928 to include various American oil companies as well. This syndicate became known as the Near East Development Corporation. Now, on July 1928, following the discovery of an immense oil field in Iraq, representatives from the Anglo-Persian Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétrole, today known as Total, which is also a major oil company, especially in France and the Francophone world, and the Near East Development Corporation, which I mentioned earlier, signed the Red Line Agreement. Each of the four parties received a 23.75 share of all the crude oil produced by Turkish Petroleum, which was allowed to operate anywhere in the Middle East between Suez and Iran, with the exception of Kuwait. Now, 23.75% times 4 is 95%. Where did the remaining 5% go? That went to our protagonist, Calouste Gulbenkian, Mr. 5%. This one man, crucial in the negotiations, sat in the middle of all these great powers and claimed a 5% share of the company that came from this agreement, of all the oil that comes out of the Middle East. Indeed, the Pasha of Iraq had specifically given Calouste Gulbenkian the entirety of the oil concession there. But if Calouste had claimed all of Iraq's oil for himself, how was that going to go for him, with the wolves circling all around? He is just one man. Calouste also saw an advantage in divesting the majority of his concessions so that large corporations could develop the oil field. He reputedly said, quote, "Better a small piece of a big pie than a big piece of a small one." End quote. It seems that part of getting wealthy is knowing when to share. The Red Line Agreement signed by all these major corporations included a self-denying clause, which meant that no member could develop oil in any of the Turkish Petroleum Company's range without getting approval from all the other members. And the meeting is called the Red Line Agreement because, supposedly, during the negotiations, no one was certain of where the Ottoman Empire's borders even were. During one of the meetings, Mr. 5%, Calouste, drew a line with a red pencil on a map based on his memory of the borders. Right, he was probably the most familiar with the Ottoman Empire, having grown up there. And so Calouste draws this red line on the map, and so the agreement becomes the Red Line Agreement. Now, as the world moves into the middle 1900s, most of the Western powers are firmly entrenched in the Middle East. They would thenceforth have stakes in big Middle Eastern oil companies, and they would be interested in the security of the region. The Saudi Arabian government granted a concession to SoCal, an American oil giant, in preference to a rival bid from the Iraq Petroleum Company, formerly Turkish Petroleum Company. By 1936, the company had no success locating oil, and the Texas Company purchased a 50% stake of the concession. In 1938, they found an oil field in Dhahran. In 1944, the company's name was changed to Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco. In 1948, various other American giants purchased stakes in Aramco. To do this, they had to get the restrictions from the Red Line Agreement lifted, because they couldn't buy if not all the other parties agreed. So they lifted the agreement. This is part of the trend, the growing trend in the 1900s of American exceptionalism. Right, like you all follow these rules, but if we don't like the rules, we just won't follow them, and you have to be okay with that. Calouste Gulbenkian would also live to see World War II. In his old age, he purchased a property in Deauville, France. When the Nazis invaded, he followed the French government to Vichy, where he became the minister for Iran for the Nazi-supported Vichy government. And as a consequence, Calouste was declared an enemy alien by the British government, even though he's a British citizen. And his UK oil assets were sequestered, though after the war, they returned his assets to him. In 1952, he refused to be appointed Knight Commander by the British government. He would spend the last years of his life in Lisbon, Portugal, and he died in the luxurious Aviz Hotel there in 1955. Calouste in his life saw the borderline medieval Ottoman Empire. He developed its oil industry, met with the wealthiest families of the world, the Nobels and the Rothschilds, saw his people massacred and fled, worked with governments all over the world, became a linchpin in securing the West's position in the Middle East after World War I, was involved in some capacity in the collapse of his empire of birth and the cutting up of the pieces afterwards. He saw World War II and the rise of the modern industrial world. He lived as both a hero and an enemy of the British government. At the time of his death, he was an inflation-adjusted billionaire, and he would leave behind many philanthropic organizations that exist to this day. His foundation, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, is today one of the wealthiest charitable institutions in the world, and it's based in Portugal, where he passed away. I hope this episode, Mr. 5%, was as interesting for you as it was for me. This was Ashrat's Tipping Points. See you next time.